it's important to unpack the definition and bring clarity, because it's kind of confusing. Because yes, anti-racism, who isn't against it? But I was looking at the work of Neil Shenvi. Is that how you pronounce his name?
That sounds
Neil
right.
Shen.
Yeah.
Yeah, Neil Shenvi. And Shenvi, yeah. So, and he's an expert on critical theory, in which anti-racism flows out of. And on his website, and I'll have a link to it in my blog. And so he just gives a definition of racism and then a definition of anti-racism. So definition of racism is opposition to racism. So that's being against racism. So like I'm non-racist, so I'm against racism. And then anti-racism, the definition is, according to Kendi, is that a commitment to actively dismantling systems and institutions that produce racism.
And
what's wrong with that?
I mean, it's, this is what I was saying, sort of. So the previous conversation that I think again, I'm not sure if we touched on the podcast, but I know we talked about it in our, prep conversation. It's like, you take the word systemic and racism and the dictionary definitions of those words, okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about. But then when people start talking, sometimes the term systemic racism is used as more colloquial than strict definition. So they start using it in a vaguer sense than what the strict definition of the word would be. And that's where, anti-racist, well, how is that any different than being opposed to racism? Like on a strict definition sense.
Mm-hmm. So like in the book, he uses the definition of a racist as one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. And then an anti-racist, one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So the point is like racist ideas always lead to racist actions.
And so this is where the Marxist piece comes into me, right? Like, so the definition, racism generally speaking will result in unequal outcome. The problem is that we're sort of we're applying a logical fallacy where unequal outcome is the result of racism. And so, commitment to actively dismantling systems and institutions that produce racism. Well, do you mean that produce unequal outcomes by race? Is that what, that's where this definition of anti-racism gets muddied? Because if you said your anti-racism is commitment to actively dismantling policies that are racist, and I just use policies as a more encompassing word, then okay, then you're sort of morphing anti-racism into being something a little bit more, but technically you're still sticking to the idea without sort of muddying the waters. But produce racism, like Joe Boot talked about this, right? He said systems will perpetuate what already exists, right? So if you have a racist society, arguably the system that that the society lives in produces racism as well, but the system is unrelated to the actual racist outcome or the racist actions being occurring. And I say unrelated because with or without them, they're not a contributing factor is sort of my point. And so again, the definitions it's meaningful because if I can't hold on to that definition, if it's hard to work with or evaluate, then I'm, how do I have a conversation about these things? Right. So, I mean, even the definition you've read, it's sort of like, okay, that's vague. Like, what does produce racism mean?
Well, I don't know. I would answer that produce racism is disparity.
And that's sort of why I said unequal outcome, because if you're saying so actively dismantling systems or institutions that produce disparities, we need to have a more fundamental conversation about disparities and their origins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, because he says racist policy is more tangible, and so he likes using the term racist policy because it's more tangible and exacting and more likely to be immediately understood by people, including its victims, who may not have the benefit of extensive fluency in racial terms. Racist policy says exactly what the problem is and where the problem is. Institutional racism and structural racism and systemic racism are redundant. Racism itself is institutional, structural, and systemic. So the idea of a racist policy is more of an exact term than using the term institutional racism, structural racism, or systemic racism. Like he said, though, those terms are redundant, and he would even say like they're somewhat vague and don't really hit the issue. And so he's saying, okay, look, my work is bringing something more nuanced to the table and looking at racist policy. And it's funny because pointing back, and maybe we should put it in the show notes, pointing back to our episode on Canada's racist policies. And what we talked about this already. We have racist policies, and we talked about it. So, when you guys get some free time, check it out.
Yeah, and that's the episode I've been referring to, right? So same episode, and that is, I would agree. I like the term, or I like the concept of focusing on racist policies. But I think, at least for me, what I would define a racist policy and what he would define a racist policy would be different. I mean, the way I think I defined it on that show, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I defined it on that show, would be that any policy that makes a decision based on race when race is an irrelevant factor, that to me is a racist policy. Now, he would say a racist policy is one, I don't know if this is, there is a quote, I'm pulling it off actually, of Sam Say Slow to Write article, How to Be a Racist. One who is supporting a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions, through their action or inaction or expressing a racist idea. But again, you go back to what you sort of have identified, that he's using racism as racial, or sort of vaguely referring to racial disparities as well. And so if he's defining a racist policy to be one that creates racial disparities, I say there's a more fundamental question that needs to be asked of what is the cause of the disparity? I said it previously already in this conversation. I do agree that racism will produce a disparity, but that doesn't mean all racial disparities are the result of racism.
Sorry, right? Sorry, what do you mean by that?
So there's a logical fallacy called confirming the consequence. So it's like if A then B is the logical premise. So racism, A, produces unequal outcome. That's the B. B, therefore A, is the logical fallacy. So unequal outcome, it's called confirming the consequence. B is the consequence in the logical statement. If A, then B. B is the consequence. So if I confirm B, unequal outcome, you cannot, it's a logical fallacy to assume that it's due to racism. Because although racism does produce disparities, I think we can all agree there are numbers of factors that produce disparities. And free will is a big factor. Preferences is a big factor. intelligence is a big factor, among other things. And not to say that we should just ignore the disparity. But again, for me, it's, are we oversimplifying the problem because we're not willing to do the hard work? You know, it goes back to even one of our first episodes where we talked about the Black Experience Project. And you know, my question was like, okay, let's keep digging into the data, right? Let's go deeper. So, anyways, but I know I'm, you know, harping on the point a bit, but I think it's good to understand the definitions as he uses them, and to say, you know, if you just concede the terms, potentially if you're getting into a conversation or dispute with somebody and you're willing to concede the terms, you've already lost, because the problem is the terminology they're using is conflating of terms, or potentially where the real dispute lies. But you can't get there because you've conceded terminology to the other side, or to your opposition, when that's really where you disagree. So I don't know, that to me is, when I see most of this content, I mean, it's the same thing with systemic racism. If we're going to start expanding the definition of a term, the problem becomes we can't have a structured conversation, because I don't really know what people are referring to when the terms they use have multiple meanings, and those meanings are harder to nail down.
Mm-hmm. And we got into this conversation in our Is BLM Sin, when Phil came on the show, and we were talking about the disparity being as a sign of racism.
Please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date. If you liked or disliked the snippet, give it a like and share your 2 cents with us in the comment section. And remember, 6 cents makes change.